He is the author of the new book, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. James Forman Jr., welcome to the show. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start from the top. What was the impetus for you writing the book? Was there any particular event or incident that served as the inspiration? What made you decide to write the book?
Right. Well, I had two reasons. One of them has nothing to do with the criminal justice system, and one of them does. So the reason that is just nothing to do with criminal justice is the fact that I don't know if any of y'all are like this, but I'm the kind of person who, when I go to a movie, and if there's no black characters in the movie, when the movie's over and people say, well, you know, how did you like it? My reaction is always like, well, where were the black characters? And so I feel that way about film. I feel that way about art, theater, drama, and literature, and law, and history. And so I knew that I wanted to write a story. I wanted to write a book that had African-American characters front and center in the story. So that was one reason. But then there's really a more specific reason having to do with working in the criminal justice system. The book has a lot of stories in it. It has history and argument, but it's got a lot of narrative, a lot of stories. And one of the stories that I tell is of a young man by the name of Brandon, and he was 15 years old, charged with possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana. He had pled guilty, and he was facing sentencing. And I was his lawyer, his public defender assigned to represent him. And I had taken that job as a public defender because I viewed it as the civil rights work of my generation. My parents met in the 1960s at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where my dad was the executive secretary. And they had passed on to me the lessons and the legacy of the civil rights movement. And when I was looking at coming out of law school in the early 90s, I saw that I had benefited from their struggle, but at the same time, there were a lot of young black folks, black men in particular, but black women as well, who were struggling, and were struggling in the criminal justice system. So we knew at that time that 1 out of 3 African-American men was under criminal justice supervision, and we knew that the United States had just passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer. So I took the job as a public defender, and I was representing Brandon, believing in that as a civil rights issue. And I'm in court, and I'm asking him to be sent home, to be put on probation. I had a letter from his teacher, from his football coach. His mom and his grandmother were there in court. They had always stood by him. It was his first arrest. And the prosecutor in the case, well, she was African-American. And so she was asking for him to be locked up, to go to Oak Hill, which is a juvenile facility, and it was really a dungeon, a terrible place with no school, no job training, drugs and violence everywhere. And the judge who had to make the decision, he's African-American too. So here he is, he's in court, he's looking at this young black man who's pled guilty, African-American lawyers on both sides of the case, me arguing for him to be sent home, the prosecutor arguing for him to be locked up. And the judge had to make the call. And he reflected on our arguments, and then he leaned forward and he looked hard at Brandon, and he said, "Son, Mr. Forman, your lawyer, has been telling me that you've had a hard life. Well, let me tell you about hard. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. Let me tell you about segregation." See, the judge had grown up in that era, and he lectured Brandon about what it was like. And then he said, so here's the thing. People fought, marched, died for you to be free. Dr. King died for you to be free. And he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your community and embarrassing your family. No, he did not. That was not his dream. And so he said, he wrapped up, he said, I hope you do turn your life around. But right now, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. And he locked him up. And ever since that day, and I had other days like that because it wasn't so unusual in D.C. to be in a majority African-American courtroom. Ever since that day, I thought to myself, well, somebody needs to write the story of what was going on in this community, to try to understand the pressures that this first generation of African-American elected officials, judges, prosecutors, police officers, D.C. has a majority black police force. What kind of pressure were they under starting in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s? What were the forces that led a judge to conclude, as this judge did, that the civil rights legacy required that he incarcerate this young man to protect the community. And so that was the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to write that history.
So let's go there also. Once again, we're talking with James Forman Jr., the author of the book Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. You talk in the book a lot about the dynamic, and you just talked about it a little bit here, of African Americans being, in some cases, disenfranchised and in a lot of cases in this system by other African Americans, where you talked about Washington, D.C., which is a majority black city with black political leadership. Why is that? Like, what led up to that point? Was there something out of the end of the civil rights era that caused this phenomenon to take place? How did we get here?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few different things. I think the first thing that we have to really focus on is that there was rising crime and violence and drug addiction in the 1960s and 1970s, and then again in the 80s in the crack years. But before crack, in the 60s, there was heroin, right? That was the crack before there was crack. And it devastated black communities. And so in D.C., for example, the homicide rate in the 1960s tripled. And they tested everybody who was entering the D.C. jail in the early 1960s, and 3% of the people entering the jail tested positive for heroin. 5 years later, in 1968, they were testing again, and they found that 45% of the people tested positive. So that's an epidemic at that point. And it wasn't just D.C. You know, the homicide rate doubled nationally in the 1960s. And it wasn't even just the numbers. You also have, I went back and I looked through letters that constituents were writing to their elected representatives, their members of the city council in the 1960s, 70s, and onward. And one of the things that really comes through is the people, the anger and the fear that people are suffering. They wrote things saying, you know, I'm a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger in my own streets. I don't know what's happened to us as a community. I can't go outside. I can't let my kid play in the playground because of the shooting. Y'all have to do something. You have to stop this. So these are the letters that are coming forth to the politicians. And now the other question and the other big argument in the book is, who were these politicians, right? Who's receiving these letters? And I think we have to really be clear that this was in the 1970s especially, this is the first generation of enfranchised African-American elected officials who got a chance to hold power after the decline of Jim Crow in the 1960s. There's an 800% increase in black elected officials in this decade. And these are folks that all come out of the civil rights movement. Many of them come out of the South, and all of them come out of a history of under protection of the law in black communities, right? They remember back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you didn't call the police in black neighborhoods if there was a crime because the police weren't going to come. And if they did, they were just going to make matters worse. And they remembered when, you know, Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan, you know, they didn't call it murder. They just called it another dead black person, and they didn't use the word black person. And so they remember that history. Now they've come into power. Now they want to protect these communities. They want to respond to those letters that I was describing to you before, and offer some semblance of safety and protection to this community. And then the last thing I'll say that happened is the people that I'm writing about. You know, I said in the beginning I wanted to write about African American elected officials. But there's no way you can tell a story about black elected officials without telling a story of the racism, the institutional racism, the structural racism, the legacy of white supremacy, and the ways in which it limited their ability to act. So the people that I'm writing about are struggling to protect these communities, but they don't have all the options at their disposal. They don't have, you know, black elected officials are in cities, by and large. A few in Congress, but we're a minority. So they can't pass a Marshall Plan for urban America. A lot of people called for that. They said, let's invest in black communities the same way we invested in Europe after World War II. Let's bring jobs, and let's bring revitalized communities. But black elected officials didn't control Congress, and so even though they asked for those things, the larger white power structure wasn't prepared to give them. So the people that I'm writing about have what I call the all of the above strategy to fighting crime, right? They want police and prosecutors and sometimes prisons, but they also want jobs and schools and education and housing and drug programs and after-school programs and parks that aren't full of syringes. And they're not able to get all those other things. The one thing they can get from the larger society is law enforcement. So they wanted all of the above, and they got one of the above, which was law enforcement. So that's another big piece of the story.
We're talking with James Forman Jr., author of the book Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. And Breezy has a question.
So I heard you talk a lot about what is happening and what is wrong, but I haven't really heard you speak much on what needs to happen to make it right. So what do you like? What do you think the next steps need to be to fix these problems?
Absolutely, thank you. There's and I have stuff in the book about this, and I think it's really important. I have a lot of ideas about things that we need to do. So we could talk about it really kind of at two levels. One is the level of like policy, and another is a level of what we can do as individuals. So from a policy standpoint, I'll throw out two ideas. The first thing is the person that has the most power in our criminal justice system is the prosecutor. And the thing that we can do as citizens to try to create a more humane, less punitive criminal justice system is to try to make sure that we have progressive prosecutors that have either been elected or appointed. So in D.C., there's a guy named Carl Racine, who's the city's prosecutor. He's very progressive. He's looking at rehabilitation. He's looking at second chances. Last November in the elections, I mean, we all remember Trump was elected, and at least from my standpoint, that was a disaster. But at the same time, in that same election, we had a lot of progressive prosecutors that were elected. They were elected on campaigns saying, the war on drugs has been a failure, and we're locking up too many people, and my predecessor convicted innocent people. We had people running on those campaigns in Florida, in Texas, in Alabama, in Colorado, in Chicago. Kim Foxx, the new prosecutor in Chicago, ran on a very progressive campaign. And that's new. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you couldn't run for prosecutor and say, we're locking up too many people. Your only option was to say, we need to lock up more.
Right.
And so I think one big thing we can do is get involved in these local elections. In Philadelphia right now, there's about to be an election next month, and there's a guy running who's very, very progressive and reform-minded and wants to push back on the war on drugs. And so that's number one thing. Let me say one other thing, and then if you want to jump in with a question too, we can do that. But the second thing is public defenders. So I was a public defender, and the book has lots of stories about my work and my clients and what it meant to be a public defender. Right now, we have cities where you have 200 and 300 people. Each public defender might have 200 or 300 people on their caseload. So as citizens, we have to push and fight at our state level and our city level and our county level to make sure that public defenders get enough funding so that people can have... See, I only had 20 or 30 clients at one time in my office in D.C. That let me get to know my clients. It let me have conversations with them, visit their families, get to know their kids or their parents, depending on how old they were, and really be able to represent them in a full, meaningful way. But if in your community, if public defenders aren't getting enough money, and most places they're not, then when you're charged with a crime and you're poor, you're never going to get adequate representation. So the second thing I think everybody can really do is try to push on their representatives to make sure that public defenders get enough funding.
Absolutely. We're talking with James Forman Jr., author of the book Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. Let everybody know where they can get the book, if they want to get in contact with you, your social media, all of that good stuff.
Absolutely. So you can get the book. It's being sold, pretty much anywhere now where you buy books. So Amazon, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it at your local bookstore. My website, which has links to where you can buy it, is www.jamesformanjr.com. So that's JamesFormanJr.com. And you can get me on Twitter at @JFormanJr. JFormanJr. That's the best way to reach me.
All right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today and really spending a good chunk of time with us. We know that you're a busy man, so we really appreciate you talking with us about the book and a very important issue to our listeners and our community as a whole.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.